Westeros Total War was one of the most anticipated mods of the past decade. Ever since the .53 beta release back in 2010, gamers have been eagerly awaiting the full release of 1.0. Many people, myself included, have been watching the mod regularly, looking at all the previews of the new units and rosters, and just generally getting hyped over it. And back in February of this year, 1.0 finally released, and the response was, frankly, disappointment. The purpose of this review is to go in depth on the creative and design decisions made by the team, explain what works, what doesn't, and ultimately try to come up with a understanding of exactly what went wrong and how future modders can not make those same mistakes. But before I get into all the issues that I have with this mod, it's worth noting that this is not a full release. The mod has been in this state for quite some time now, and it appears that the team eventually decided that they were not going to ever finish it the way they wanted to, and so they decided to simply release it in the hopes that someone else would take up the mantle and put all the finishing touches on. However, that being said, this video is less of a review of you should or shouldn't play this game, and more of an analysis of how we got here and Westeros mods as a whole. And to start that analysis, it is necessary that we go back, way back, to the strange and exotic time of 2010. Medieval 2 Total War offers 4 distinct modes of play: single-player battles, multiplayer battles, single-player campaign, and multiplayer campaign. While pretty much all mods offer all 4 of these modes of play, they do always make decisions that emphasize one over the other. .53 is a perfect example of a mod that strongly emphasizes multiplayer campaign balance over everything else. The reliable forwarding mechanics allows players to plan out their moves like their chess game, instead of simply being a big giant crapshoot over who has the better agent or siege equipment. Moreover, the limited selection of lords, and especially the limited selection of good lords that can command armies, makes it incredibly important to focus on individual characters and to build up their traits in order to acquire things like, say, the Night Fighter trait, which ends up proving to be incredibly useful in most hot seat games. The most important thing making this mod great is the asymmetric balance between the factions. Sure, the Lannisters and Tyrells are strong, while the Dornish and Starks are weak and isolated. However, through diplomacy, any coalition can be built to oppose even the strongest of factions. Moreover, the ability for the king at the end to divide up their spoils among the victors allows for some factions who would never be able to conquer the whole map to still have a shot at glory and success. Good games are about having to make interesting decisions given a set of rules, and especially for, say, House Lannister, Joffrey, or Renly, to make the decision early in the game whether to try to build a navy quickly to compete with Stannis and the Ironborn, or to try and rush inland and take out their enemies so they're strong enough to withstand a naval invasion, is one of the all-time great conundrums that I don't think any player has been able to successfully solve and answer. The presentation, meanwhile, is frankly pretty underwhelming. The units are just recolored Medieval 2 units, the lords, a couple have custom portraits, but many do not, and the campaign map is, frankly, underwhelming, especially compared to a lot of the later work that was done for this mod. But ultimately, none of that matters. This mod knows exactly what it's trying to be: a superbly finely tuned and balanced hot seat mod. .53 may not have been a finished product the way that its designers intended, but it served an incredibly important role in that it spawned out countless other submods that went on to become very successful. Among these are the King of Rivers and Hills, one of my personal favorites, as well as the Blackfire Rebellion, the War of Conquest, the Winds of Winter, a Game of Thrones themed mod that brought the aesthetic of the show into the game itself, and of course my own mod, Age of Petty Kings. All of these were built using the original files from 0.53, but over time, all of the various pieces were replaced with new things. The map that I ended up in Age of Petty Kings was originally made by Toho, I believe, before I made a lot of modifications to it. A lot of units from Petty Kings were taken from other mods, and a lot of other mods would create their own custom blends of units and UI as well. While 0.53 reigns supreme in the realm of hot seats, many of these mods instead took over as single-player experiences with well-fleshed-out campaigns. There were hot seats for them too, but many of them, in particular, Age of Petty Kings, were designed primarily with a single-player campaign experience in mind. Now, I just want to be clear here that when I bring in Age of Petty Kings, I am absolutely not trying to rub anything in or say that my mod is in any way better than the current 1.0 that's being released. I think that they're both great mods and they're both very different mods. The reason that I'm bringing up Age of Petty Kings, and 0.53 as well, is that my two main issues with 1.0 from a design standpoint are both addressed very differently in both 0.53 and Petty Kings, and I think that they provide interesting counterbalances from a design standpoint. The first of these has to do with the way that they treat named characters. I mentioned earlier that in 0.53, you're sort of limited in your initial selection of competent generals and lords. There would occasionally be generals garrisoning castles, and you have a few in the field with large armies to begin with, but mostly you were limited, and over the course of the campaign, you would occasionally get to adopt new characters into your house. This means that any army you have is going to be made up almost entirely of units that you have recruited yourself, and then maybe you'd have one or at most two or three lords tagging along to help. You would never see more than 3 lords in an actual army that was marching around in the field, and usually you would not even see that many. Petty Kings took a somewhat similar approach. Each faction at the start of the game has a lord in every castle with the appropriate house title, and then I would generally add maybe 2 or 3 other lords that were in the field who would be relevant to the plot. Like, for example, in the north, there was the Lion of Winterfell, who was like a Lannister that went up north, and things like that, where they're going to be your main leaders during the campaign, where they'll be marching around and leading armies. Again, this is meant to ensure that the army that you take to the field is the one that you built by recruiting units in your territory explicitly. Now, let's contrast this with 1.0. On top of having characters start in pretty much all of the various castles, as well as a number of various family members that start outside of the castles, pretty much every starting faction has over 20 named lord characters with regenerating bodyguards at the very start of the game. Generals in Medieval II Total War exist to lead armies. Sure, there are plenty of noblemen that exist in England and Westeros and presumably Middle-earth, but it's implied that the various units of knights that you recruit are made up of those various noblemen. It does not make sense that somebody like Hallis Hornwood would have a official 20-unit regenerating general's bodyguard alongside him. To make matters worse, unlike normal units, generals cannot be disbanded, and they are going to cost you upkeep money in order to keep paying their salaries. This means that from the very start of the game, you are forced to play your campaign with an army made up entirely of generals' bodyguards that you cannot get rid of and that you have to use. Even worse, since bodyguard units regenerate constantly, it means that even if they take casualties in battle, unless the actual characters themselves die, which in Medieval II doesn't happen all that often, you are going to be stuck with them forever. The saddest part of this is that, as I'll get into in detail later, the actual units themselves that were created for this mod are amazing, they look wonderful, and since Medieval II battles are the most entertaining to play if you bring a balanced army, this means that we are in many ways prevented from playing with the beautiful and amazing units that they created because we're instead stuck with an army made up entirely of a single kind of general's bodyguard. I understand that George R. R. Martin loves to create tons of different characters, but I think that honestly, if the mod creators were to go in and delete maybe 3/4 of all the named characters that they included, the game would become a lot more fun and a lot more playable almost instantly. That being said, this seems like a good time to also share one of the things that I absolutely love about this mod, that being the units and the rosters. One of the many things that got people so hyped about Westeros Total War 1.0 was the amazing looking previews that we saw of all of the various units, and having finally been able to play the game, I have to say the mod creators completely delivered. The unit models are some of the best in Medieval 2 modding, standing right alongside those from Third Age and Warhammer. Little details like antlers on the Storm Knights' helmets really help to drive home the love and care that was put into all these models. Moreover, the texturing itself is superb. The individual unit faces are actually recognizable, and many of the characters from the books you can actually recognize on their horses. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for a Game of Thrones mod, all the heraldry from the various houses is right there on display, in full and glorious, colorful George R. R. Martin fashion. From a gameplay standpoint, the design of the rosters provides a lot of interesting variations with hybrid units like the Riverland Sentinels, which can give you a lot of different utility, as well as a lot of lore-specific units that are related to various specific regions, like Umber Greatswords, or Crack Hall Macemen, and Bracken Cavalry. These provide a lot of fluff, as well as really helping to round out the rosters. Ultimately, it's a nice way to reward players for recruiting units in specific regions and bringing them to the front. Which is unfortunate because recruitment is the next thing that I'd like to talk about. 0.53 and Vanilla both have very straightforward systems for recruiting units. You conquer a castle, build a barracks, and then you're good to go. This works great for hot seat balancing because you don't want to have your competitive play bogged down with weird recruitment scripts. However, it's also not terribly true to the lore behind Game of Thrones to be able to simply march into a castle and immediately rally the populace to your side. In Age of Petty Kings, I addressed this by making a script where conquered regions will eventually bend the knee to your rule. The idea here is that once you have conquered an entire enemy region, such as, say, the area around Winterfell, or the Wolfswood in the north, or, say, the borderlands between the Reach and the Westerlands, you can then recruit the units that were originally recruitable from that region. This is meant to show how the houses of that region have now bent the knee to you and are going to now fight in your army, similar to how the Riverlords fought for the Lannisters in A Feast for Crows. The idea behind this is that while it does create a slight roadblock to the player's rapid expansion, it also creates a series of interesting decisions for them to make. Specifically, regions don't bend the knee until the entire area has been conquered. This means that the player is encouraged to finish the conquest that they start in order to be able to recruit in conquered territories. Moreover, there's also a bit of a reward at the end if the player actually goes through the trouble of doing that. By getting access to the new regions and recruitment rosters, they can fill out the weaknesses in their army and gradually build up their force to eventually create a kingdom of the scale that we saw in the later Game of Thrones universe. Westeros 1.0, on the other hand, operates somewhat differently. First, religions have been replaced with house loyalty, meaning that in order to be able to recruit your troops in a region and get better public order, you have to first make the region into a more House Lannister-y region by building certain structures. This is an interesting idea on the surface, however I'm not sure how well it actually lines up with the lore in question. In the books, houses tend to fight for their overlords basically up until the bitter end, at which point they all switch sides and start fighting for whoever their lord has bent the knee to. Once the Riverlands have been conquered, it makes sense the Riverlords would now fight for House Lannister. Up until that point, it does not really make sense that, say, the parts that were already conquered would slowly be coming around to Lannister rule. However, this is first and foremost a game, and lore accuracy is not necessarily a problem. However, my other criticism is that as a mechanic, it really does not provide many interesting choices for the player to make. You are given the choice between several different building chains. However, since these mostly have different effects on public order and the places that you conquer are mostly castles, there isn't a whole lot of reason not to go with the one that involves a bigger public order penalty. Ultimately, since you're always going to construct these buildings in the region you conquer, this is a mechanic that creates complexity without providing depth. There are also certain bugs that I believe are caused by this system. At the start of the game, faction recruitment pools are all completely empty, so if you want to, say, specialize your army around a certain type of unit, you can't do so until about 10 or 20 turns in, once the recruitment pools have refilled. Also, I ran into issues constructing these buildings until after I had played a battle, at which point I was able to construct the proper buildings to subdue provinces. However, as I said before, this is a beta product, and so I'm not going to judge it too harshly based on things like that. I was never an official member of the team, so this is all pure speculation. However, I suspect that bugs like these were one of the reasons why they were hesitant to release the game back in 2014, when it was more or less in this state. Which then brings me to the final criticism that I have of this mod. 2014 was the height of popularity for both the Game of Thrones series, as well as in many ways the Medieval 2 modding community. I was in the midst of working on Petty Kings, and countless other modders were doing the same with their own projects. That's also roughly the time where work seems to have more or less stopped on this mod. The latest preview for the House Tola units was posted on May 1st of 2013, and I believe that was the final roster that was needed to complete, meaning that my favorite aspect of this mod, the faction rosters, was already completed back in 2013. Moreover, the gorgeous campaign map that far surpasses anything seen both in Westeros, as well as arguably in Medieval 2 mods in general, was completed more or less around the same time. Now, I completely understand the desire to not release a buggy and unfinished product. I would even say that a certain degree of perfectionism is incredibly important for a modder. If you don't feel like everything has to be perfect, then odds are you're not going to complete a mod in a way that the rest of the world is going to want to play. And speaking for myself, I always deliberately avoid mods that I feel are hacky and unfinished.
You know, my brother once told me that nothing someone says before the word but really counts.
But there does eventually come a point when it's time to release what you have and let others continue the work for you. When I was making Petty Kings, there were many times when I came within an inch of stopping the work, simply because I assumed that 1.0 would be out any day now, and there was no reason to duplicate the stuff that they had already done. That didn't happen, but I suspect that other modders felt the same way, and some of them may have even stopped work simply because they were waiting for 1.0's assets to be made available to them. Moreover, imagine the kind of works that could have been created had the 1.0 assets been released at that time. I can easily imagine amazing War of Conquest, Blackfire Rebellion, Rivers and Hills, and even Petty Kings mods being created using this as a base. And to deny that does a disservice both to the community, but even more importantly, does a disservice to the amazing and beautiful work that was put into all these assets. Now, I understand that nobody wants to throw their work out online so others can take the credit for it. And that's completely understandable. But really, I would recommend a rule of thumb of maybe 8 months. If it's been 8 months since you have last worked on a mod project, at that point it's probably time to release the assets online and see what other people can create using your work. I did something similar a couple years ago when I released my Age of the Five Kings assets online, once it became clear to me that I was not going to finish because I was just completely burned out. But sadly, that didn't happen for Westeros 1.0 until just earlier this year. Medieval 2 is an incredibly old game, over 12 years old I believe at this point, and it's definitely nearing if not reached the end of its life cycle. Sure, there will always be people who want to play the old mods, But by now, I suspect most have probably moved on to games like Total War Warhammer 2, and others like it. This may be sad, but as Yoda says, death is a natural part of life. We should rejoice for the great times we had with Medieval 2, but we can also mourn the times that never came to pass. And I just want to be clear here that the last thing I want to do with this video is try to be mean to the people who put all this amazing work into this mod. I understand and empathize with all the decisions they made along the way, and in their place, I may well have done the same thing. Rather, my hope here is that future generations of modders can take this as an example to see what you can and can't do in a mod, how certain mechanics intertwine with one another, and how they affect what you're trying to achieve, and most of all, when to compromise with something good instead of trying to fight for something great. Westeros Total War 1.0 is currently out on ModDB, and you can download it at the link in the description. In spite of all the flaws that I've laid out now, it is still absolutely a terrific mod, and I hope that you download it, that you play it, that you enjoy the battles, and I hope that one day people will take another look at the campaign mechanics and hopefully improve those in the way that I've described. Full credit goes to the Westeros Total War team and all the blood, sweat, and tears they poured into the project over the past decade or so. Thank you, and I say this sincerely on behalf of the community, thank you for your hard work. Admiral Thrawn, signing off.